You are watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. I am one of your hosts, Eugene Puryear, here as always alongside my intrepid co-host Rania Khalek. Rania, good to be back with you.
Eugene, it's always fantastic to be back on with you.
You might say the pleasure is all mine.
Well, wow. The pleasure is all ours, Eugene. This is a team effort.
Okay, yeah, but to be alongside you, I'm saying the pleasure is all mine. But anyway, however you want to do it, you can do the royal you kind of thing. Anyway, long story short, very happy to have.
Start.
Yeah, it's kind of a cold open type situation here, but welcome everybody. Very happy to have you as we always do here on Breakthrough News. And of course, we got a great show for you. Plenty of fantastic things to talk about, from the Indian subcontinent and some of the politics there, the evisceration of public education here in the United States, the Guatemalan elections, the elections in Zimbabwe, the BRICS Summit, which is ongoing, the Republican debate, the first ever Cuban Little League team to enter the Little League World Series, and at the very end, we will be talking about the potential, I guess, even though it hasn't been 100% confirmed, demise of the chef, Yevgeny Prigozhin, in a plane crash in Russia. Chef, among other things. So stick around to the very, very end where we will update you on that as well. We'll also mention a little update as it concerns Niger, where, of course, events are moving very, very rapidly. So again, great show. Happy to have you. It's a great time for you to hit the subscribe button, hit the bell so you can get the alerts and get all of the fantastic content like Dispatches with Rania Khalek. And Rania, what else would you like our viewers to know this evening or afternoon?
Well, this afternoon. Well, it is evening for me, so I do appreciate you being time zone inclusive. Well, for those who are watching, you can support the show. Not just this show, but all of our wonderful work here at Breakthrough News by becoming a patron of Breakthrough News at patreon.com/Breakthrough News, where you can get access to exclusive content as well as cool merch, such as the wonderful, beautifully designed mug that Eugene is holding up there, just like Vanna White. I got it.
Who's a very successful person, by the way, so I'm happy to be compared with her.
Or like those people on The Price is Right who hold the things and show you and do this. Do you like this?
I do know.
So definitely patreon.com/Breakthrough News, get access to exclusive content and some of our very cool merch with our fresh new logo that is looking fantastic on the mug. I can't wait to get my hands on one of those. You can also donate. If you want to do a one-time donation, you can donate in the live chat if you're watching on YouTube. And also, I want to remind those who are watching to make sure that you're not only following Breakthrough News on YouTube, but also liking the show, liking the live stream. It helps us in the algorithm. So make sure you're liking, and I will come back throughout the show to berate our audience for not liking. Because oftentimes, that's the only way to get them to do it.
Indeed. Sometimes negative reinforcement works, but as it were, definitely would appreciate all your patronage, all your donations of any sort, including live here today inside of YouTube. We want everyone who's following you to be following us, so now's also a good time to text folks, knock on their door, yell at the person in the car next to you or something. I don't know. Let them know to get this on. I don't know. No one should be watching this in their car. But if for whatever reason they are, make sure that their YouTube is set to Breakthrough News before they crash. One way to go out. At least to be something pleasant in your ears. I'm just saying you shouldn't be driving and using devices like that. But
also,
nonetheless,
I feel like we shouldn't be encouraging people to knock on the doors of people they don't know, because it is America we're talking about, where that can get you shot sometimes.
Well, I would hope that the people who watch Breakthrough News are friendly with their neighbors, because this is a family, community, neighborhood-oriented show. So I'm sure they'll be very safe when they knock on their neighbor's door, and neighbor will appreciate them.
I hope so.
We all do. Well, why don't we get the show started for real here and get right into it with our first story, which is you almost don't even know what to call it, the massive crackdown that is happening in Pakistan, in particular on supporters of the former Prime Minister Imran Khan. And we are very, very happy to be joined for this conversation by Junaid Ahmed, who's a professor of religion, law, and global politics in Pakistan. Junaid, thank you so much for being back with us.
It's a pleasure to be with you, and Eugene especially. Rania, I've been with before, but huge fans of the work you do, and tough times in Pakistan, and I'm glad that shows like yours are covering it.
Well, we really appreciate you coming on to help us sort through it all. I mean, I think for most people watching in the United States, the issues in Pakistan just almost immediately fell out of the news, maybe over a month ago. But there are thousands of people in prison, including the former Prime Minister Imran Khan. Allegedly he's in prison for corruption. I believe it was today. They're now trying to add on more charges. So, I mean, what is the situation in terms of his legal case, and what has it led to in terms of the broader movement of individuals who were supporting him in his efforts to oppose or to come back to office?
Right. I mean, it's a long story, and I've been writing about this for a long time. Of course, what has sparked the immediate outpouring of kind of now finally believing what the Prime Minister said a year and a half ago about how the U.S. was meddling in the United States through this leaked diplomatic cable, what the Pakistani call a cipher. And now, so the story comes out a year and a half later, after millions have been mobilizing in the country, and now Khan is sitting in a wretched, jail in which he can barely fit. And today, the Supreme Court, the charges that were leveled against, there's actually many charges leveled against him, bogus, frivolous charges. And what they're trying to do now is basically, since this is probably the most frivolous charge that they put him in, like high max prison that they put for terrorists, what they think is that, if we say the Supreme Court kind of giving guidance to the Islamabad High Court, maybe this one was not as convincing, but there's so many other charges, and we'll send them right back to jail on another charge. Particularly one now they're speaking about this anti-terrorism legislation under the Army Act, in which on May 9th, when Imran Khan, again, I could go into the context, I don't know how much time, obviously the most popular leader in the country by far. On May 9th, he was, all these charges that were leveled against him, he was going in and outside of court. It's not like he's trying to escape anything. So he was going and responding to all of these allegations against him, judges dismissing them as frivolous, etc. Of course, this was before we have the full-scale military dictatorship in the country that tells everyone what to do, that ignores all Supreme Court justices, everyone. And so at that time, they released him then, but on that moment, when they tried to arrest him, it was not an arrest. When he went to the court, he hadn't even begun the proceedings, and he was abducted, and obviously the outpouring of support came. But what was totally and completely clear now, that it was entirely engineered and orchestrated by the collaboration of the military intelligence apparatus with the 13-party coalition that had to be cobbled up together to get him removed constitutionally from a motion of vote of no confidence. That was, of course, stirred on and encouraged by the United States State Department, the Assistant Secretary of Donald Liu, as the cable says. But as I've said before, well before even Khan's ouster, there are a lot of reasons why the United States and generally Western NATO or the collective West have despised Khan for many, many years.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing that we definitely need to talk about is the fact that I'm sure you saw The Intercept published the secret cable, the secret Pakistan cable that documents the U.S. essentially pressuring for the removal of Imran Khan as prime minister, specifically over his neutrality on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And of course, this is one of many reasons why the U.S. was incredibly frustrated with Imran Khan. I'm curious, can you talk a bit about that and what has I assume there's been some sort of reception in the country about that. And you might remember a year ago or over a year ago when this all started, there was a lot of debate over whether the U.S. played a role at all and whether this even constitutes a coup or not.
Right. So this obviously what the Intercept retrieved from is sources within the military, and of course this is also becoming a new kind of charge that they're leveling. That no, this was Imran Khan leaking out the cipher so they can get another charge on him or some of his political party members. When the Intercept has made it very clear, and I have always consistently said that this is probably the first instance in the history of Pakistan in which a civilian prime minister is more popular within the ranks of the military than the chief of army staff, who is always the most powerful person in the country. And so it's not a surprise that so many officers, certainly soldiers, I mean, maybe 90% of soldiers, but officers, mid-rank, junior rank, even higher rank, would leak out such a cable. This cable obviously was an official document, and of course they were obviously dissatisfied with the way the military crackdown was happening. And yes, this leak happened now. Of course, we've had journalists who have tried to leak precisely this cipher, and they have been hunted down all the way to, say, Kenya, to be killed because they had a copy of the cipher. And we have another journalist who's been missing for months, etc. So this was a big deal in one sense, to prove to many people in Pakistan that yes, Khan is not just some conspiracy nutcase. That yes, when Khan visited, and this is the whole thing, the entire discussion is about basically Russia and Ukraine and so on. And so when Khan had long before planned a visit to Moscow to visit President Putin, while he's in the air, I mean, going there, he doesn't know the Russian special invasion, a special military operation or invasion of Ukraine happens. And immediately, the collective West expects him to condemn him as he's getting off the plane to shake his hand, right? Condemn him right there. So, all the stereotypes of Putin. Would you like to be there, standing there in Moscow, and start to condemn him? But that's by the by. So when he returns back to Pakistan, immediately, once again, Western European capitals start to say, okay, now you're back. Now condemn. Now this is not this pressure is not put on India, etc. Trading, violating the so-called American sanctions, but nothing put on Khan to condemn the Russian invasion. I mean, and finally he comes out in a public speech and says that, look, this is insane. He says that and this was very popularized in the global South, we are not slaves of America or anyone. We are not slaves. Actually, he just said it. We are friends with the United States. We're friends with Russia. We're friends with China. We're friends with Europe. We are not part of any alliance. And then he goes on in the speech and says that, hey, we've been speaking about the Israeli occupation of Palestine and what's going on with Kashmiris. Does anyone condemn that when we ask them to? No. And so, and it's important to remember, Khan has always been a pacifist. Throughout the war on terror years, he said despite, I mean, obviously the anger and frustration at what the U.S. was doing and the human toll. He's saying we will be friends in times of peace, but not in war. We cannot. Of course, he was a lone voice because the Pakistani government and military was obviously participating with the United States. The leak and this Russia-Ukraine thing is very important. And I mean, the language in it is so ridiculous. Where the State Department Assistant Secretary of State says that, we kind of have a problem with this aggressive neutrality that Khan is demonstrating, and the extent and what the vote to condemn Russia. Pakistan, like so many, as you all know and have been covering in the global south, abstained, and this aggressive neutrality, and then goes on to say that but if Khan can be removed from power in the next few days, etc., all will be forgiven. Otherwise, there will be consequences, isolation, etc. And then the State Department and the White House spokesperson for the past year have just been denying that any of this has been taking place. So, I mean, that's the story about Ukraine. But there's a larger story in which the national security state of the United States never forgave Khan from 2001, when the war on terror started, for protesting, drone strikes, the war itself, the war on terror itself, all of these things, and actually being proven correct that there's no military solution to these problems, and that there's two things: that is both immoral and illegal in terms of the human toll and consequences, and that it's counterproductive. It's only going to fuel more militancy and terrorism, and that's exactly what's happened, especially because of the spillover effects of the war in Afghanistan into Pakistan. And so Trump came in, and Trump says anything that he wants sometimes, and he liked Khan, this superstar cricketer, and went on and on and on. And Khan is just sitting there quietly and asks a question or is required to say something. He says, "I'm here to discuss, the Kashmir issue with." That's it. And so, but as Biden comes into power, no phone call to Khan, no engagement, to the extent that even when Pakistan was helping the United States withdraw from Afghanistan, I mean, you literally had American soldiers in Islamabad hotels, etc., and that I even chatted to personally, and still no engagement with Khan. Clearly, I'm sure the engagement was happening, which is actually a long legacy from the Cold War of Pakistan choosing the wrong side, being in the American camp, and the relationship has been between the militaries of two countries. The core relationship has been between the two militaries, and it seems like it's back again, right, to that type of approach right now as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot to be said here and a lot more to continue to discuss, and we will continue to discuss with you, sir, and many others. Junaid Ahmed, professor of religion law and global politics in Pakistan. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
It was my pleasure. I'm sorry for going on and on.
No worries. It was perfect. Thank you so much, and we'll definitely reach back to you. Appreciate you.
Most welcome. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Rania.
Yes, I mean it's yet another episode of how the U.S. engages in geopolitics that demonstrates one thing that we're going to be talking about later on, which is why there is this attempt by so many countries to find like an alternative mechanism to organize, because it's like this. I mean, this level of like violating the sovereignty of a massive country. It's just there's so many examples of it, and to see it once again proven true. And I do remember like not that long ago when people were like, no, that's not a coup. It's silly to just assume the U.S. was involved. And then here you have it.
Yeah,
and it's really bad.
Involved.
I mean, there's people who are scared to even like speak out or
I
say
think there's
anything
10,000 people
publicly.
in prison. You've got,
Yeah.
most of the top leaders of his party have quit politics, and these weird statements like, we will no longer be involved in politics, like, for the rest of our lives. So it's a real serious situation there, and I think we know what it's about. And I certainly think that the dispatches you did with Junaid Ahmed on this issue, I mean, even though it was many months ago, I think still have a lot of key fundamentals that people should go and check out in our archives on YouTube. But we'll, of course, keep following it. Very important issue, what's happening there in Pakistan. Well, we are going to turn the page here back to the United States, to the state of West Virginia, although this story absolutely has many, many ripple effects in higher education and what it really means for working class people across the country. And we are very honored to be joined for this conversation by Dr. Lisa Corrigan, who's a professor of communication and director of the Gender Studies program at the University of Arkansas. Ooh, Pig Suey, and also the co-host of the podcast, Lean Back. Dr. Corrigan, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Very happy to have you. And sorry, for people who don't know college football, I had to do a little University of Arkansas shout out there. Some people I think have seen the story of what's happened at West Virginia University, maybe sort of surface level. They've eliminated a huge amount of programs, but maybe just let's start there before we get into the implications of it. The president there of West Virginia University, what has he done that is causing so much outrage?
Well, he spent a bunch of money and run up a $45 million deficit. And the response that he's providing to make up for those cuts is to cut faculty lines and whole programs. And it looks like about 17 programs are on the docket to be sliced and diced. There are faculty right now who are meeting with the tribunal to try and save their programs, despite the fact that the numbers seem to prove that those programs are actually fiscally responsible and making money. So understandably, there was a walkout yesterday, and students are very upset because many of their majors are on the chopping block.
It's really upsetting. I mean, I can't imagine having to bear the consequences of that. But one thing that I thought was really interesting is that these cuts, as you wrote in this piece, were recommended by a consulting firm called RPK Group, which just sounds as like neoliberal as it gets, is like having some consulting firm coming in and making a university essentially act like a corporation, which is what we've seen happen for such a long time across education in the United States. But can you talk a little bit about the significance of that and what it means in terms of the way that we treat education in the US at this point?
I mean, I think the larger issue is that the Republicans would love to have a signature piece of legislation that cuts federal funding for higher education. And they can't get it through. So instead, they support these shadow groups and these consulting firms that are the low-key hatchet man. So yesterday, a story broke that Ben Sass in Florida is doing the same thing at the University of Florida, where they bring in these consultants. There is no advise and consent for faculty senate. There's no feedback mechanism for the students. And then suddenly programs just disappear, despite the fact that they're money makers or they're popular, or they produce tremendous amounts of grants and awards. So I think you're right. It is the neoliberalization of the university, but it's also ushering in this huge, prolific number of tech people into higher ed poised to take it over.
I think this is such an important point because it's coming at, a real inflection point, as it were, with how we view education. And you mentioned that, and I buried the lead here, but you wrote a great piece about this in The Nation, the evisceration of a public university, which I hope everyone checks out. But how, we're having all this new money going to community colleges, technical schools, which is sort of all fine. But the fact that it's happening at the same time that sort of higher education is, at least we've thought of it over the past 60 years, as being eviscerated, is sort of, I think you called it a bleak future, and I certainly agree with that. But talk about, what it really means for the type of system we're creating in terms of, what a quote-unquote higher education means.
I mean, without robust reinvestment in public higher education, there will be two tiers of education. The elites will have the Ivies, which are tiny and serve a small minority of the U.S. population. And the rest of the students who go to state schools and go to community colleges basically get VOTAC, right? They're not going to have languages. That's one of the first things on the chopping block at WVU is the entire foreign language program, which means that only the elites will have access to foreign investment or international law or international human rights or any tracks where you would need a second education. So that's a luxury of the United States because we're not crammed up against a bunch of other countries speaking other languages. And so we have the jingoism that prevents us from learning foreign languages and foreign cultures, but only the elites will have access to that kind of education. And what's going to happen is you're going to hear more and more of this language of job training. Students at public universities, especially Research One universities, land-grant universities, need job training. They don't. They need to learn how to be better citizens, and that means a robust, critical intellectual engagement with ideas from multiple perspectives and a large liberal arts curriculum. And honestly, what we're hearing from all of these major Fortune 500 companies is that even the people that they're hiring in the United States for really specific technical jobs, they prefer students to come into those jobs with a broad liberal arts background because it makes them better skilled workers and it makes them more fungible in the workplace. They learn better, they have more to contribute, they have a broader exposure to ideas that are global. And so even though Fortune 500 companies want that kind of student, a well-rounded student with a liberal, robust education, these corporations are really advocating the opposite, and they're crushing that kind of fertile ground for thinking. And you're right, Eugene, it's not just a zeitgeist that's happening in higher ed, it's also coinciding with this obvious massive authoritarian push in the United States and around the world. And that's probably more troublesome, right, is that the corporations are getting funding from, shadow GOP groups to do this kind of infiltration of higher ed.
That's a really good point, especially about creating like a two-tiered system, basically, of like who comes out of what and who gets what jobs. And then there's also the politics of it. I mean, all of this is, of course, what you're talking about is politics of it. But I just mean there's also been this like very culture war aspect to the way that Republicans have been treating not just higher education, but just even like, elementary school and high school across the country, and really targeting a certain kind. I mean, you mentioned liberal arts, but like there is a political motivation here. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, the culture war is always about race and diversity. And so in my mind, as a scholar of the 60s and social movements, it's very reminiscent of Brown v. Board in 1954, right? The reason that public education became the terrain of desegregation is because whoever controls public education and who has the opportunity to influence students through set curriculum sort of controls the agenda for liberalism in the country. So this is a moment that's returning us back to those debates in my state, Arkansas, which of course had the desegregation showdown in 1957 where Faubus, pushed back the students at Central High. We're living that moment again as our governor tries to ban an AP African American history class. So the war on woke is really a recursive structure. It's something that reappears over and over again in the American political imaginary to harness those conservative impulses to crush critical thinking skills. And education is always the place where race panic about affirmative action and about women in higher education and sex panic about LGBTQ people or trans athletes collide. And so in that way, it's not very different from 1954, and that's what probably makes it so troubling.
No, absolutely. Amazing that the so-called education-focused governor of Arkansas are trying to ban knowledge, but perhaps not that surprising. But, one of the things you mentioned at the outset is there's also the rise of these administrators making huge sums of money and these sort of vanity projects that they do that, I think anyone who's familiar with lives in a college town, exactly what we're talking about. But talk more about that, because I think that trend is also an important factor of what's been happening at colleges and universities.
I mean, part of it is that the public land-grant universities are in this position to have to chase like outside money, right? So they have to go find private donors that come and endow programs because federal funding for higher ed has been slashed so desperately since the 07-08 Bush cuts. And so that puts them in a position to then try and hire like politicos to come and run their schools, and their expectations for salaries are super high, way higher than the average professors. And so there's this inflation happening at the top of, higher education that is also reflected in what's happening inside of mega corporations, right? Where the people at the top are siphoning off tremendous amounts of money, not just in salary, but also in fringe and in parachutes, right? When they ultimately get fired because they don't know anything about public education. And so, a restructuring of public higher ed really needs to involve two things: massive federal reinvestment and a real look at, salary caps for administrators. It would help with a lot of things in college towns like mine that are being driven through these huge changes in terms of property values and housing availability and other things.
I'm just really, also, I'm curious, you mentioned at the end of your piece for The Nation, that, Biden has basically pledged more federal money to community colleges and vocational tech schools, which is essentially which is a good thing, of course. I'm, and saying we shouldn't fund these things, but it's essentially kind of playing into what Republicans are trying to do. Is there a pushback? I guess the question is there a pushback among Democrats against this? Or is it kind of falling flat? Is anybody taking this seriously and trying to do anything about the fact that state schools and universities are being starved now?
Two things about that. One, I think, is the student loan debt conversation is essential. So Biden's student loan debt forgiveness is incredible as a wealth transfer back to the educated, the kids who go to state schools and take out loans to go get a master's degree. It is tremendous in revitalizing people's ability to participate in the higher ed conversation at a different level because they're not drowning in their student loan debt. So he absolutely must be applauded for that. It is tremendous. I think we'll see more of that kind of work in a term if he gets one. But in terms of the reinvestment into the public sector and public higher education, from the federal level into higher ed, not yet. And so I think that's something we have to continue to push for. I think the meltdown at WVU is the canary in the coal mine. It's a thing that's happening in other places, the University of Utah, the University of Alaska. You're going to see it happen in a bunch of other states. However, much of the land grant schools, especially in the middle of the country, including the University of Arkansas, we are seeing the highest enrollment numbers in years, in part because of the pandemic, right? So we are seeing and serving tremendous numbers of students who are coming to our universities, and we don't have the space for them, and we don't have the faculty to teach them, but they want the education that we provide. So in some ways that creates some leverage, right, internally and also externally to the federal government to make the case for more federal investment and restore and expand the funding that Bush cut in 07-08 right before the recession.
No, it's such an important point. And maybe just the last thing I'll ask you is it seems like there's almost a connection between, maybe the lack of a push around more funding and more reinvestment in higher education and the sort of culture war politics around higher education, is that there are so many people who, maybe know better in their heart of hearts, but they're afraid that it's bad politics to look like they're funding some, liberal, whatever caricature.
I think so, but I also think that higher ed has been behind the eight ball. Academics are not known to be rabble-rousers, and quite frankly, the entire federal turn against higher education, especially after the 60s, really nipped that impulse in the bud. And even campus design changed, right, to make it more difficult to protest on campuses. I'm thinking about Northwestern in particular and colleges in Chicago, but it happened across the country. So I do think that there's a material change that has happened to Research One institutions that makes, protesting there less possible. I also think that bringing in all of these consultants and former politicos to run universities make coordination inside of the university more difficult. And I would just say that most state universities we can only have as many lobbyists as the governor and the legislature allow. So it's not like we can bring in more troops to make the case for a robust higher ed funding. The final thing I would say on that is the cuts to the programs that are funding our grant funded research at the national level are really troubling on this point. And I actually suspect that that's where we'll see the most pushback probably in the next 2 years, is to restore funding for the NEH, NEA, and NIH to fund university sponsored research.
Mm-hmm. Well, very important article, The Evisceration of a Public University, about West Virginia, which is the canary in the coal mine. Dr. Lisa Corrigan is the author. It's in The Nation, and she's also a professor of communications and director of the Gender Studies program at the University of Arkansas. Dr. Corrigan, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me. Be well.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rania.
Well, Eugene, that's a really upsetting story, but I'm glad that there are people who are energetically pushing back, such as the guest we just had on. I feel I need to note that I'm very happy to see 937 people are watching the show live. However, Eugene, only 329 have clicked the like button. So I'm just wondering what's happening with the other 550 some odd people. If you're watching this show, please do press the like button. Helps us in the algorithm. I see the number going up. Thank you.
Perfect.
Also, I should also throw in that if you do like Breakthrough News, if you appreciate this show and all of our other what I think are excellent shows on Breakthrough News, all of our great work, please do consider becoming a member of Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News, where you can access exclusive content as well as some very cool merch. And I'm not going to make you pick up the mug again, Eugene, but we have a very cool mug.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure if you keep watching the show, you'll see it again since I am drinking out of it. But yes, we do have a very cool mug, among other things. But yes, very good points. Very important reminder, Rania. I appreciate that. And I'm sure our viewers, I almost always say listeners, appreciate that. But we are going to keep the movement moving on here. We want to turn our attention to the recent presidential elections in Guatemala. And we are very, very happy to be joined as we continue the show by Marco Castillo, who is the co-director of Global Exchange. Marco, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Eugene. Thank you, Rania. Happy to be here.
We are really happy to have you to break this down. The recent victory, although I know that's still being challenged, of Bernardo Arevalo in the elections there in Guatemala seemed to be a break from the right-wing politics of that country and certainly seeming like it might be a change, had some historical significance. So maybe just, if you will, give us a sense of who he is and what his win really represents in terms of what voters in Guatemala are looking to see.
Thank you for the question, Eugene. So right now, the final results after over 4,200,000 votes counted, Bernardo Arevalo, it's ahead with 58% of the vote versus his opponent, Sandra Torres, with 37%. So this is a landslide victory for a new party, relatively new party, mostly led by youth in urban spaces, even though in this last election, a lot of the rural and indigenous vote also added a significant amount of votes to the election. But it's a landslide victory that potentially represents a possibility of a better future for a country that has been historically kidnapped by corruption and impunity, and it has suffered the consequences of false democracy, and that it's in the hands of a small group of corrupted politicians and businessmen and women that have taken over the country's economy, their resources, their fundamental rights in their hands. So what I would like to add, Eugene, if I'm allowed,
Please.
This is a small party. They don't have a big structure. They're not a traditional political party. So their victory is basically based on millions of followers across the country that are not affiliated to the party. The consequence of this being a small party is that once you become government, it's going to be hard and it's going to be a challenge for them to build a government with such small structure, and they need to be very careful in what are the people that they bring into the government, who do they work with when in terms of businessmen and sectors from the church, from the private initiative. That's going to shape a lot of what's coming in the months ahead. And also, on the other hand, today we heard that the oligarchy is trying to strip the registration of Semilla as a political party. They're trying to remove that and then trying to get to the president-elect Bernardo Arevalo and bring down his victory. So in the months ahead, we're going to see lawfare, all kinds of judicial action against the candidate and all those who were part of the election day, because they are also looking into all the people that were at the voting side representing Semilla, that the Supreme Court formally requested the list of names of all of them, they're probably going to be also going after them.
I think that this is also like regionally quite important. In terms of just the fact that we've seen this sort of like tide that some people call pink tide 2.0, or like some sort of progressive tide where a lot of left wingers are winning presidencies in some places that have been, in the hands of oligarchs and in some cases militaries for quite some time. And of course, this victory was well received. In many of these places, you heard congratulations from the Honduran president. You heard congratulations from AMLO. I'm just curious, for Guatemala, I mean, this is a big deal. What does this mean, do you think, for the region, that there's like another, force of progressive politics to add to the list?
Thank you for the question. And I think it's really important to discuss this, because I really want to be taking one step back and saying we still don't know for sure how much of a progressive government this one would be. It represents an alternative. It definitely represents, a change in the historic, political parties that have been ruling Guatemala. So this is a new emerging force. It is definitely youth-led. Their main driver has been ending corruption, but they have still not taken a stand on many other, racial, ethnic issues. The indigenous movements, the historical left in Guatemala are still looking critically on what this new government is going to offer. And we know that Bernardo Arévalo is the son, the elected president, Bernardo Arévalo is the son of another president that is well regarded in Guatemala, Juan José Arévalo, who was the leader of Guatemalan Spring when most of the institutions were built. So there is hope that Arévalo will stand up to this legacy, but we're still not sure, because when being asked, he's still being, on the neutral side, because obviously the opposition were accusing Arévalo of promoting an agenda, pro women's rights and inclusion, that they were going to, take land from farmers and all this kind of fake news that the right was using. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to see a really progressive government. We'll still need to figure it out. How do they land? So that's why I insist that it is important to see in the next months who they build alliances with, who do they work with. And so it's going to be really important for us in the region to look closely at these models, because in a country when we have a lot of crazy people going on and running as candidates, like we're seeing in Argentina, or we look like this figures like Bukele in El Salvador, we really need to see this as an alternative and other ways of addressing the issues that are hurting the region that don't require having cyclone power.
No, I think that's it's a really important point on a number of fronts, but one that it certainly makes me think of in terms of the direction of the government is the fact that, there were some left-wing candidates that were banned from running in the election in and of itself. And it almost seems like, almost then from the beginning to the end of the election, what we're seeing now with Sandra Torres and others trying to challenge the election is part of one, very troubling sort of deeply anti-democratic impulse that's been happening in Guatemala. I mean, of course, we had essentially the scuttling of any sort of accountability for those who were involved in the genocide of the indigenous people in the last administration. Then you go into this election, candidates are banned. Now you have them trying to find a way, the right wing, to invalidate the election. So, I mean, it seems like this is really a huge theme of this election as well, which is how much the sort of legal realities are being manipulated to prevent people from really having a say in terms of how they want the country to be governed.
Absolutely, Eugene. I mean, this is also something we need to look at from a regional perspective, because it's similar to what we're seeing in Peru and in other places. So yes, the oligarchy it's full of fear. It's freaking out literally to the possibility of a new government with no compromises, looking at the history of all this established politicians that for decades have been stealing the people's money. So yes, they are using all resources at hand. But again, we need to see how this lands in when it comes to reality. I was visiting, and I was with indigenous communities in Guatemala the days before the election. Again, hearing from them, they see the problem with Guatemala beyond the election. They are not 100% optimistic because they know that many problems in Guatemala are structural, and will need that any government will be able to take a step back and be able to review some regional agreements. For example, land reform. In Guatemala, it's one of the countries where there's a pending land reform for decades that historically, like for centuries, has been, displacing indigenous communities and allowing private interests to establish themselves anywhere they want without any recognition or rights for historic owners. So there's a large list of things that this government will need to respond to in order to, prove what it's made from. So far, seems like youth and urban sectors believe in this government and say that it is possible, and we need to stand in support for them, but we also need to be critical and demanding that they build the right alliances in the region and across the globe to move forward in the right direction.
And also, I'm just curious because so much has not changed for a very long time. This is why this is getting so much attention right now. It's like a huge shift. So why now? Why such a shift in the political scene in Guatemala?
Thank you. Well, there's many theories about that, but I'll just mention a few of them. So this victory, it's a result of a decade of youth mobilizations across the country that started in 2015, 2016, where students were taking the streets and taking universities through a massive spring of activism, where all colleges, private and public, were taking the streets in demand for fair elections, for a future. And that's when they saw the Jimmy Morales election in 2016, that again was counterculture, Trump kind of candidate that got the people's attention for the way of managing the media and social media, but ended up being a crazy psychopath who ended up in prison a few years after, and was responsible for getting rid of the International Commission Against Corruption that was established in Guatemala for decades. And so after that disappointment, there is this period where the right came back, and the current president, Giammattei, was in power, and again reminding the people of how corrupted the establishment could be. And so that brought back the need, the energy, the enthusiasm, and also several academic sectors were meeting throughout all this time, trying to think what are the alternatives, the democratic alternatives for Guatemala. And that's how, in the end, students, academic sectors, and some other progressive sectors came together and founded CEMI, that they will support this government. That means that if you look at through the eyes of lawfare and other ways of in which the global powers can exercise control over a national government, then we'll see if the U.S. is getting ready to pressure this new government in other ways. But so far, the U.S. embassy has also been respectful, and President Biden immediately went on and recognized the victory of Arevalo, which definitely 2 decades ago they wouldn't have.
Well, we really appreciate you being willing to join us and help sort through this, and a lot that we'll have to keep watching and keep reporting on. But Marco Castillo, co-director of Global Exchange, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you very much to both.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Eugene.
Yes, Rania.
I got to do it again. I'm just going to after every segment. Very happy to see 985 of you are watching the show live. Thank you for watching. Please do, if you have not already, press that like button though, because only half of the number of you who are watching have pressed the like button. It's super easy. It's a thumbs up. It looks like this.
Thank you.
Okay, it's a little icon. Press it.
Yes.
helps us in the algorithm.
It does. And I want to shout out Alicia Chafin, Elba Matos, and David for donating to us here as the show has gone on. Really appreciate that. Elba Matos with a $50 donation. So big shout out to you. Thank you so much for that. Not that the amount necessarily is the thing that matters, but I do want to recognize people who are digging deep to support us here at Breakthrough News. And of course, in addition to giving here, you can go to patreon.com/Breakthrough News and become a recurring donor. Get this coffee mug. You can also get other forms of merch. You can get access to special exclusive parts of the Rania Khalek Dispatches episodes. I do a seminar. Who knows? We'll even try to add more. The more you donate, the more we can add and the more we can do. So you have to look at it like that. Your recurring donation will get you more exclusive content over time by helping to build our capacity, which I know you all want to do, which is why you are here. A lot of things that we could say while you are here, Rania, and perhaps one of the things we should discuss is the ongoing BRICS Summit that is happening in South Africa, in Johannesburg, the 15th annual BRICS Summit. Of course, we talked in the lead up to this with Vijay Prashad last week, which I think people should certainly check out. But we're seeing now the fruits, perhaps, of the summit. The big announcement that came out this morning is the 6 additional countries that are going to be added to the BRICS. I do not have it in front of me, so let's hope I get it right. Argentina, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Ethiopia. How many have I listed? United Arab Emirates. That's, I think, 6.
UAE.
I think that's all of them. Yeah,
Yeah.
UAE, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Argentina. I think that's them. I don't know.
This is
Sorry,
a big
Ron, did I
deal.
cut you off?
No. Well, this is a big deal in so many different ways. I think that, first of all, these are not like, obviously one of these countries is Iran, which probably wouldn't surprise many people. They're just like, oh yeah, some American country is going to join BRICS, of course. But no, some of these are American allies. I mean, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt. Many people could even describe them as client states of the U.S. in many ways. I thought it was interesting that the Saudi foreign minister spoke to the BRICS members today and basically emphasized that he believes in respecting the independence and sovereignty of states and not interfering in their affairs. And I think this is important because what you see happening here is that even these very close allies of the U.S. Are demonstrating that they're like, they're sick of the U.S. telling them what to do. And there's an opening right now to look to other countries for partnerships, for economic partnerships, to be a part of a different economic bloc that doesn't interfere in their country. And I think that says a lot about the way a lot of countries view places like China and Russia. They don't see them as countries that try to bully them or interfere or try to violate their sovereignty. And I also think that it's, huge that you have Saudi Arabia and Iran joining. I mean, these are and the UAE, these are massive oil producing countries. And, one of the US's biggest fears about BRICS is the idea that it could undercut the US dollar by trading outside of it. And now you've got the Brazilians talking about a potential alternative currency. You're bringing in all these oil producing nations. I mean, until they actually start trading in something besides the dollar or selling oil or trading oil in something besides the dollar, it won't really make much of a difference. But there's a huge potential here. And that's why you see the West freaking out, because this does pose a potential threat to the Western hegemony over the global economy.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And UAE being added, I think, is particularly notable in that regard because India and Russia do some trade already in the dirham, and India in general has been using the dirham, the currency of UAE, a little bit more in terms of other different international transactions. And we've seen, because Dubai really in particular, but also Abu Dhabi are such big financial hubs, there's a lot of value. There's, some level of value in having the dirham. It's a flexible currency that can be used easier than a lot of the individual currencies currencies that don't have a lot of international representation now. Worth noting, UAE and Egypt, along with Bangladesh, had joined the BRICS Bank a couple years ago. So now to see UAE and Egypt ascend to the BRICS itself, is an interesting, we'll see, but perhaps that may be how you get a sense of some of the countries who are going to join. They joined the bank beforehand. But nonetheless, I think when you look at the reality of this, I think you see a few things. Oh, and one other note that I think is interesting too, before I say what I was going to say. Argentina, which has been and to be fair, these are invitations to join, so countries can decline.
Right.
Most of the countries have basically already accepted, but Argentina is the big question mark because the outgoing president, Alberto Fernandez, has been pushing this, has been pursuing this. The $44 billion in debt that the previous president of Argentina took on and the overhang of the 2001 IMF debt default have left their economy in a very tough situation. And so Alberto Fernandez has sought to build closer relations with China especially, and other countries in the global south to try to kind of reshape the ability of Argentina to rebuild its economy by opening up new opportunities for trade, for loans, and so on and so forth, because they are pretty it's pretty difficult for them to get into the loan markets. There's a lot of pressure against them. But nonetheless, the leading candidate, Javier Milei, in the election, he has said that he's basically against the BRICS. Some of the other candidates are. It's not even clear if the successor to Fernandez, if his party won, if they would pursue it. So that's going to be an interesting question in the rest of the election campaign in Argentina of what is Argentina's future in terms of the how the country is going to be oriented. Obviously, Lula was very much pushing, the president of Brazil, for Argentina to be brought on. But I say that to say that I think when you look at the countries, it's an interesting subset of profiles because, you add Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which are obviously very, very wealthy countries. UAE is already a part of the New Development Bank. Saudi Arabia will now become a part of the New Development Bank. But the New Development Bank, the contingent reserve arrangement that they were trying to put forward in terms of being able to lend, but being a lot fairer than the IMF and the World Bank. I mean, that element of the BRICS, the possibility, as you were mentioning, Rania, of the building out the robustness of the BRICS financial architecture will be heavily assisted by adding these two very wealthy Gulf countries into the mix. I mean, they will also gain, but it will bolster the bloc. And on the other hand, you have, Ethiopia, Argentina, Iran, which, in some ways is a wealthy country, but I think the real reason why those countries in some ways are added, it's kind of a different profile. They either have a very well-developed economy that's very diverse like Iran, or Argentina, although it's on the back foot, or like Ethiopia, have a lot of possibility to have a very developed, very robust economy. So it's sort of like they're adding immediate capacity to be able to build out the technical, infrastructural, financial base of BRICS to help the other countries that they've added reach their economic potential, which then, of course, will fold back on the BRICS and then make the BRICS even stronger. So you can see there's certainly a logic, to adding the different countries and the different modalities in terms of strengthening BRICS in the immediate term around the things they need to strengthen the BRICS in the longer term, which shows that the countries who are in BRICS are thinking very strategically about the future. And I think as Vijay reminded us last week, the whole reason BRICS existed is because, the G7 economies collapsed in 2008 and, the extreme exclusion from the United Nations, the sort of, marginalization inside the international architecture, that countries that are powerful and rising were looking to have some form of pushback or alternative to, even if they didn't want to abandon the old structures. It seems that logic is continuing to play itself out in the new countries that are being added to the BRICS alliance here, so the BRICS plus 6. So we'll see. I think Argentina is the big question mark. Most of the other countries, from what I've seen, have already, said yes, basically. And certainly, of course, another issue, Iran and Saudi Arabia, of their rapprochement, the détente between them, which I don't think. And I don't know this to be sure, but now that I'm seeing this, I actually do feel that their accession to the BRICS is a part of why they came together. Because you saw Saudi Arabia said that they wanted to join the BRICS when they had the Saudi-South Africa financial summit, and they gave South Africa $20 billion. And then China starts working on both countries. I mean, you just see the way that it was working, where all the BRICS nations, you had just a couple weeks ago, the National Security Advisor of India goes to Iran and says, we'll do everything we possibly can to get you into the BRICS. So it seems like there may have been a quid pro quo there for those countries to pursue a deeper diplomacy among amongst themselves as the precondition for them both being able to accede to BRICS. So, of course, I don't know that for sure. I haven't seen that reported anywhere. This is just my own reading between the lines. But if I am right, I think that it also opens up a separate conversation about the role of forums like BRICS, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, to become centers for also resolving some of the thornier global issues diplomatically.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point. If that is true, it basically turns these like organizations of like essentially global South countries into mediation opportunities. I think it's fantastic. On top of that, I also think it's interesting the role that the war in Ukraine may have played in pushing certain countries to want to join the BRICS bloc, in the sense that, like it's been reported that one of the reasons that Egypt, for example, wants to join is because the war in Ukraine basically caused Egypt's currency to devalue because of the fact that there was all these investors pulling billions of dollars out of Egypt because of these wheat and fuel imports, and then that had been bought in dollars, and then it caused prices to soar. And regardless, I mean, it created a dollar shortage in Egypt that led to the currency devaluing pretty badly, and Egypt already has a really extreme poverty problem and a high unemployment. So being inside an organization like BRICS, where you have the opportunity to perhaps trade in your own local currency, is certainly an attractive idea. And then there's also the fact that you have countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Basically, they were kind of already, a bit frustrated with the U.S. because it seems as though, all these U.S. schemes across the Middle East are just backfiring on them because they're on the front line, right? Like when it comes to the Houthis, who's getting hit by Houthi rockets? When it comes to any potential war with Iran, where is Iran going to hit? It's going to hit the U.S. client states in the Gulf, right? So there was already a frustration building. But then comes the war in Ukraine, and you've got the U.S. leaders basically like demanding, Saudi Arabia make decisions about oil that aren't actually good for Saudi Arabia, but are just good for the U.S., and demanding the UAE, stop allowing Russians to put their money in UAE banks. And it's just like, okay, but like that's our economy. So like this, in a way you could say the arrogance and entitlement, and I mean just downright narcissism of the U.S., and then, the way it's like been going after Russia and trying to force all of these other global South countries to do the same to their own detriment is pushing their own allies away from them, which is kind of like a funny little, I don't know, irony, I guess. But I also wanted to ask you, Eugene, about Ethiopia. I think I was not expecting that. I mean, I know Ethiopia maybe had at some point said they'd like to be a part of BRICS. But I was just a bit surprised to see Ethiopia thrown into the mix. I mean, this is the second largest country in Africa. And obviously that's another situation where the U.S. hasn't exactly been very kind to Ethiopia over the last few years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I mean, when they applied, I thought they had a pretty good chance just because they already have good relations with all the BRICS members. So I thought, they had at least a puncher's chance. But I did not know, and I won't say I was surprised, but I certainly was like, oh, they made it. I mean, I think, there's a whole range of issues that are here. I mean, I think the first issue you can raise is, and it'll go to the second issue, I mean, it is a very, I would say, negative result for the United States. I mean, in the wake of the ending of the, proxy war that was being waged by the West on Ethiopia through the agency of the TPLF, the former ruling party that launched this unbelievable war and conflict, the Western powers have been trying to use the issue of debt, the issue of IMF loans very coercively against Ethiopia for a range of different issues, some of them political, to try to get them to do certain things political, some of them economic in terms of the type of structure. Basically, you have the IMF and these other countries. They want Ethiopia to open up the economy more for foreign investment to come in and exploit the country, basically. And Ethiopia has been to some degree resisting that, to some degree not. But also politically, they're hoping to make sure that Ethiopia remains sort of a client state of the West, which under the TPLF for 32 years, it certainly was that. It was the anchor state of the region that allowed Western control. Of course, it was the agency by which Somalia was destabilized on behalf of the United States' interest to control the region. And we could go on and on like that. But I say all that just to say, that by entering BRICS and becoming eligible for loans from the new development bank, which tend to be infrastructure related, but also related to food security and things like that. And certainly the new development bank is saying that they're going to be more aggressive. They just actually put out their first Rand-denominated debt issuance in South Africa recently, and it was oversubscribed. So they're raising more money in local currencies of BRICS nations as well, but then they're going to hopefully, be engaging more directly. So that means that the economic weapon of the West to try to coerce Ethiopia to do its bidding in the region, is going to go down. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I think there are questions to be had about how much more debt they should take on right now, but that's a separate conversation and a separate issue, and I do think it sort of frees their hand. And I think to some degree that is why they applied to join. I mean, Ethiopia has long-standing relationships with Russia, China, India, South Africa, so they were already working with all those countries, actually quite closely, building their trade with them and so on and so forth. So they didn't really need to technically join the BRICS bloc to continue to integrate into that. Brazil as well, they have budding relationships with them. But what you've seen is, I think, a attempted charm offensive by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed on the United States and on the West. And I think he's made many choices over the past year that seem 100% designed to appease the West, but they have not actually gotten what they wanted. And the West has continued, in the U.S., by the way, there's still all these bills in Congress that could potentially sanction Ethiopia, and the Biden administration refuses to remove them. Congress refuses to address them. They still have been removed from AGOA, the free trade program that a lot of their, industrial development was sort of predicated on, at least light industrial development as well. They're still kept out of that. And the IMF is still, dancing around this issue of debt relief and seemingly obstructing the possibility for greater debt relief for Ethiopia. China has unilaterally forgiven some debt, but over some, other issues, devaluing the currency, a big devaluation, and a few other things, they're trying to push on them. But I think it's also politics. So to me, it feels like this was a move by Ethiopia to say, okay, fine, if you're going to stonewall us to this degree, we will deepen our integration even more. They were already part of BRICS Plus. We'll deepen our integration even more into this bloc and also try to join it so that we can open up some more tools in order to be able to push back against your agenda. Now, I think there's many other things that could be said, but I do think that that is sort of the base reality. And I think for the other BRICS countries, the reason why they want to have a country like Ethiopia is exactly what you said. You had 110 million people. I think probably more like 120 million. It's a very, very populous country. It's growing in terms of its economic power. It's got a lot of contradictions and problems within it, but it has a lot of powerhouse capability. It's one of the countries with the highest diplomatic stature on the African continent. And so I think it adds, in some degree to the luster of the bloc, but I think the potentiality for Ethiopia to develop also, like I said earlier, is a real sort of potential cornerstone reality for the BRICS bloc in terms of its growth to then sort of rebound 5 years down the road and really strengthening the ability of these countries to be able to trade for one another, which is the final thing I just want to actually add here about this. Maybe not the final thing, but the final thing I want to say in this round of talking, Rania, about that is I think we talk a lot about the BRICS, we talk a lot about the BRICS Bank, but we often forget, there's the BRICS Universities Network, there's the BRICS Science and Technology Collaboration, and you look at a country like India, just was the first country in the history of the planet to land a probe on one of the lunar poles. So, a lot of the countries are doing interesting things. Iran, in the pharmaceutical industry is developing all these different pieces. So there's also, I think, a question for countries like developing countries like Ethiopia in particular, that are at a relatively low level of development on many of those things, how joining the BRICS bloc is an interesting test for how some of these other subsidiary parts of the BRICS actually can work. Can they help strengthen the civil society? Can they help strengthen the educational realities? Can they help strengthen the science and technology infrastructure of these countries without the mediation of the West? I think is an interesting question, an interesting one we'll see. And I think a country like Ethiopia will be an interesting test case for how these different BRICS forums are able to truly collaborate to the benefit of the members.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a really good encapsulation of everything that we have to see. But most importantly, I just think the significance of this can't be overstated, but also shouldn't be like thought of as like, oh, yay, U.S. hegemony is over. It's not exactly what's happened. But this is definitely a part of the sort of like ongoing decline of like Western capitalism right now. Western dominated capitalism, at least. And I think this will be one of those turning point moments when BRICS expanded. Like when, 50 years from now, when people look back to analyze, like, how did this happen? And what were the important moments? This will be one of them.
No, I think you are definitely right. And, a lot more to say about this. And I think we'll probably end up talking about it again next week. There are a number of other heads of state, by the way, that are also there, high-level officials. President of Eritrea, Isaias Afwerki, is there. The foreign minister of Belarus is there. A number of other African heads of states are there. So I'm sure there's a lot going on the sidelines as well. Civil society, media conversations that we'll pick up on in the wake of it. But, yes, I think it's potentially at least a very big inflection point moment. But we want to turn the page here, and we're going to turn back to the United States, where last night we had the first debate of the 2024 election cycle, the Republican primary debate. And of course, the frontrunner, Donald Trump, did not attend, but he did conduct an interview with Tucker Carlson at the exact same time. So in a way, sort of his own debate-like statement. So we are very happy to be joined to discuss all of this and maybe a little bit more by Walter Smolarek, the editor of Liberation News. Walter, as always, thank you so much for being with us. Oh, you're muted.
Oh, those technological gremlins.
Well, yeah, on one side or the other.
On one side or the other. Well, I do appreciate, I hate it seems so unfair to see Walter's lovely face and that smile and to just not be able to know what he's saying. That's not fair. It's like a nightmare. While we try and figure that out, I do want to remind people to please make sure you like the show because it helps us in the algorithm. And for some reason, Eugene, it's like weird. It's like, there's 1,200 watching, but only 690 have liked. I just don't understand that difference.
Well, maybe they're waiting for the end of the show when we talk about Prigozhin in Niger to decide if we are.
They want to see what our take's going to be.
Yeah,
they want to see what our take's going to be.
Yeah.
Well, please do like the show. It helps us in the algorithm. And also I'll take this as another opportunity to remind those of you, especially if you're new and you don't know, if you like this show, if you like what you see at Breakthrough News, you can help support it by becoming a member at patreon.com/breakthrough news, where you can access exclusive content. Wow. I'm stumbling over my words. Exclusive content, including special parts of my show, Dispatches, as well as Eugene's monthly seminar on Africa, and very cool merch. Eugene, show us that mug one more time.
Of course.
I mean, he's so good at it. Look at that awesome mug, as well as other merch too that has a similarly very cool look. Become a member at patreon.com/breakthrough news. And of course, if you want to do a one-time donation, we are happy to take those as well. You can do it in the live chat. And hopefully we can get this tech issue fixed because
I think we may have it. I think we may have Walter with us.
Okay.
Walter, thanks for joining. Yes.
We can hear you.
Great. So glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yes. Well, we are really happy to have you. There was like 2 hours and 45 minutes of Republican content last night. Trump and Tucker Carlson, and then I think it was 8 people on the stage at the Fox News debate. A lot we could get into, but I mean, Walter, maybe just give me your first impressions of the Republican field after what we saw last night.
Right. Well, I mean, I think one thing that definitely stood out to me that this really, hit home was the fact that the Republican field, the presidential primary, is completely disconnected from the main issues that are affecting the lives of working people, the vast majority of people in this country. I mean, just think about what people are dealing with right now. I mean, there are huge problems like, the spiraling cost of living. Inflation has been hammering working class households. The price of rent has gone up dramatically. So many millions of families are unable to make ends meet. People have been getting kicked off of food stamps. People have been getting kicked off of Medicaid and Medicare. All of these pandemic era relief programs have been rolled back, leaving people in terrible situations. But none of that was important enough, apparently, to be mentioned by the Republican candidates. I mean, to the extent that they even talked about inflation at all, they talked about this totally bogus theory that inflation is the result of, the CARES Act or, the pandemic relief programs. But the actual suffering that people are going through, again, doesn't even register. It's not something that they're interested in talking about, which is pretty much par for the course for U.S. politics. I mean, this was a debate among different factions, sections of the elite. There were, slight differences in flavor. Maybe on a couple issues there might have been some substantial disagreements. But again, we just see a handful of ultra wealthy people representing even richer donors who don't care at all about what people are going through.
Yeah, I mean, I only got to see some of the highlights. I did not watch it live because it was the middle of the night, my time. But from the highlights I did see, so like I had predicted beforehand that there would be a lot of discussion about who hates China more or like who hates immigrants more. But it seemed there was a lot more about abortion than I was expecting. There was that going on. There was also this like one thing I did notice is that also it seemed really boring. Not that it should be so exciting, but it seemed quite boring. And I mean, looking at the broader sort of horse race grand scheme of things, I just don't think that among this crew of Republicans that there can be one that's capable of winning a national election. And I don't want to eat my words, so I'm saying from now, things can always change. But it just doesn't seem to be the case. Like also with Trump having his interview with Tucker Carlson, it just looks like a really split party that at least right now doesn't seem capable of, rallying the troops nationally to get one of them to victory. Now, none of these people, I don't know if you would agree with that assessment or what you would like to add to that. And again, I also want to be cautious in predicting anything from now. It's still quite early. However, go ahead, Walter.
Sure. No, I do agree with you. I mean, I think that the field of candidates are pretty pathetic. I mean, Ron DeSantis was supposed to be the one guy who could take on Trump, who could, maybe fill Trump's shoes as like the leader, the dominant figure in the Republican Party. But his campaign has really been a joke so far. I mean, he's been unable to step out of Trump's shadow. He's been unable to really even cut an independent profile for himself. He rose to prominence, and this is something that Trump points out all the time, and it's actually true. He rose to prominence on Trump's, coattails, right? He became the governor of Florida after Trump endorsed him. On the campaign trail, he's really incapable of even criticizing Trump directly. So he just comes off as this, very weak and, almost pathetic figure, also very personally weird and awkward. He's not a good campaigner. He hasn't been able to raise the amount of money that he would need to raise to, really be able to challenge Trump's domination of the Republican Party. So he's out, right? I mean, that's probably not going anywhere. Again, like you said, we can't be, totally sure. We can't be totally predictive, but it's not looking very good for Ron DeSantis. And then who's in, third place in the opinion polls is Vivek Ramaswamy. And his politics are, completely pro-Trump. I mean, that's kind of his shtick, right? He's like a younger version of Trump, kind of a younger representative of the MAGA movement. And all but, I think it was Chris Christie and Doug Burgum, or Chris Christie and Asa Hutchinson, said that even Trump's conviction, right, even his criminal conviction at trial would not shake their support for him if he becomes the eventual nominee of the party. So if all of these candidates are too afraid, essentially, to run like an openly, overtly anti-Trump campaign, how can they really expect to garner enough support to really sort of to come out at the head of the pack there? I don't really see it coming to fruition.
Yeah, it was amazing to see, DeSantis actually wait to see who raised their hand about the issue of would they support Trump before he raised his hand. Pretty unbelievable cowardice there that Vivek sort of scored him for. But yeah, I mean, it's the whole thing. It's amazing. I mean, the very first question of the debate is about this Richmond, north of Richmond song. And of course, one of the lines there is about how overtime doesn't pay. Now, of course, none of the Republicans on stage, surprise, mentioned that one of the reasons why that is the case is that the Trump administration, with their support, ended the overtime rule that would have made sure that people could be paid more for overtime and more people would become eligible for overtime. But that's neither here nor there. I guess you can't talk about reality in a Republican debate. But the area where there's probably the most heat, if you will, in terms of differences between candidates. One, certainly in the Fox News debate, where they were trying to stoke some debate between Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis. Certainly something that was dwelled on in the Tucker Carlson interview with Trump is the issue of Ukraine. Obviously, the Republican base has been becoming more and more bearish, if you will, on the Ukraine conflict. So more Republican politicians have been coming out and criticizing the aid to Ukraine, but basically none of the people other than Trump and Vivek who are running in the campaign are doing the same thing. So I just wonder how you evaluate that, Walter, because it's obviously one of the biggest issues in American politics right now is what U.S. policy is towards Ukraine.
Right. Well, I think that we can see, obvious policy differences on display there, but we have to separate that out from the underlying question of U.S. war and empire. On that underlying question of U.S. war and empire, should the Pentagon reign supreme over the entire planet, there's total unanimity among all of the Republican candidates and the Democratic candidates. The sort of America First position that Vivek Ramaswamy was sort of the principal advocate of inside of that debate. Trump, talking to Tucker Carlson, advocated similar policies. Essentially, skepticism about the particular policy of limitless military aid to Ukraine is something that, on the one hand is designed to score political points, because to a lot of people, it truly does not make sense. And it doesn't make sense to be sending tens of billions of dollars to fight a proxy war in Ukraine against a country that is not actually, a threat or menacing the United States. That comes off as a ridiculous waste of money to a whole lot of people. And some candidates want to opportunistically capitalize on that. And essentially, they put it in the context of ultra-reactionary politics. So, the line that we heard, again and again at the debate and also in all sorts of right-wing media is that we need to secure our own border before we secure Ukraine's border, right? So deploy the U.S. military to the U.S.-Mexico border, commit all sorts of atrocities, violence, intimidation, terrorism against people who are in very desperate situations trying to cross the border into the United States. Let's deal with that quote unquote problem before we go over there and help Ukraine. So that is, obviously something that's completely contrary to the spirit of international solidarity, of unity of the peoples of the world. And that's the basis that we can really bring down the U.S. war machine. That's the only basis that we can organize real, true, lasting opposition to the war machine. At the same time, all of these candidates are for huge Pentagon budgets. None of them want to cut the Pentagon's budget. And when Trump was talking to Tucker Carlson, he essentially said, oh, well, if I was in charge, none of these international conflicts would have broken out in the first place. The war in Ukraine would have never happened in the first place, or it would have been over in a couple of weeks if I was in office, because I'm really tough, essentially. And I'm able to deal with all of these other world leaders, and all the other politicians are weak. And that toughness that Trump is talking about is premised on, his support for a $1 trillion U.S. war budget, $1 trillion+ U.S. war budget, constant massive increases to that war budget, essentially so that the U.S. can terrorize the rest of the world into submission without actually deploying its military force, without actually engaging in wars. That's probably a fantasy, right? So, and it's completely hypothetical. So if he was in office and, one of these crises broke out, and the question was, will you back down or will you use military force? The entire premise of his position, this sort of, speak softly and carry a big stick premise, is that you would actually use that military force. So the idea that, the America First Republicans will just build up the U.S. military to unprecedented heights, but then never use it, that would mean that peace would prevail in the world is like a total fantasy.
Yeah, that is a total fantasy. I'm curious because, of course, what ended up getting more attention, I think, than the debate was the Donald Trump sit down with Tucker Carlson. So what do you have to tell us about the significance of that, Walter?
I think that it was a smart political move on Donald Trump's part. It sort of set up the situation where, the official Republican debate was essentially like the playoffs, right? The question isn't who's going to be the Republican nominee for president. The question is who's going to take on Donald Trump for the Republican nomination. Like Trump is already one of the finalists, and then all of these other candidates just have to fight with each other to see, who gets the honor of being the main challenger to Donald Trump and probably losing, right? And then, DeSantis he didn't say all that much, right? He was obviously trying to give very cautious answers. Really, to an extent, it was a battle for third place. Like, who's going to take on DeSantis for the right to take on Trump for the nomination? So setting it up this way, refusing to participate in the official Republican debate and setting up his own thing with Tucker Carlson on Twitter really helped drive this narrative home that Trump is sort of like the guy to beat. And that's true. That's reflected in all of the opinion polling and all of the fundraising totals. And the longer this contest for second place plays out, the closer we get to the actual voting, right, to the beginning of the primaries in early 2024, and the less time whoever emerges will have to make up the gap between their own limited support and Trump's very considerable support.
I know we're just about at time, but I do want to ask you this, Walter, because the other area that there's total unanimity from the top to the bottom, from Trump to whoever's at the bottom, Asa Hutchinson, is this extreme, I would almost call it semi-fascistic approach to policing and quote unquote law and order in America. I mean, despite the fact that every study that's ever been done on this has shown that longer sentences do not deter crime, or the death penalty does not deter crime. There's an extreme focus on longer sentences, locking people up, throwing people in prison, massively increasing the police inside of the United States, freeing the police. Vivek Ramaswamy made this point very significantly, freeing the police from any form of oversight whatsoever in terms of killings and murders and all these other pieces. So, I mean, it really is in many ways amazing to me, quite frankly. But I wonder just how you parse that, because the fact that there's total unanimity amongst all Republicans about that, I think, is very important, and some parallels to the point you were making vis-a-vis the foreign policy.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this absolute embrace of the police. And, the only problem with the police, if you ask the Republicans, is that there's so many constraints on what they're allowed to do, who they're allowed to beat and harass and kill. I mean, it's completely disgusting. And also, it's obviously part of essentially a counteroffensive against the people's movement, against the uprising that, stole the world scene in 2020, became this, massive historic event. The supporters of the cops, the right wing, the racists, they want to roll that back. And this is one expression of that, which also exists inside of the Democratic Party, of course. But yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous. Like, the Republican theory of crime, the right wing theory of crime is that, essentially people commit crimes because they're morally deficient or they're crazy. And so we either need to, really crack down on people, put the inherently bad people in prison, lock them up for, extremely long periods of time. Or the question is just, funding more mental health programs, because that's really the only reason a person would decide to break the law, right? If they're morally deficient or if they're, out of their minds. That is completely ignorant of, of course, like all of the scientific study that goes into, quote unquote criminality, but also just basic common sense. I mean, the fabric of society in the United States is being torn apart, not because of people's personal decisions, but because of capitalism, because the unbelievable inequality, the hoarding of wealth by a tiny, tiny minority of millionaires and billionaires have created desperate circumstances for so many people. Extreme levels of poverty, skyrocketing homelessness, the inability to find a decent job, a job that pays you enough to live with dignity. All of this creates the conditions where illegal activity, horizontal violence, whatever you want to call it, can thrive. None of the candidates were willing to seriously tackle that. None of them were willing to seriously consider, how do we change the circumstances in society so that people can live in peace and dignity.
Mm-hmm. Well, Walter Smolarek, editor of Liberation News, liberationnews.org, where I'm sure there'll be plenty of analysis on the election as it develops. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Eugene, that was a great recap of what is sure to be the first of many, many incredibly boring debates. Let's hope they stay boring, though. With Republicans, you don't want things to be too exciting. With anybody, in this situation. You don't want things to be too exciting. I do want to tell our audience, or remind our audience, I should say, please do be sure to like the show. It helps us in the algorithm. Just a reminder, look how I'm being nice. I'm trying to use positive reinforcement, Eugene. We'll see which works better. Also, I wanted to update you with some news.
Please.
I'm not sure if you saw, but since this is what we're going to be talking about, which is the death of the, I guess, former leader of the Wagner Group, Prigozhin is how you say it? Yevgeny Prigozhin. Putin has expressed his condolences over the jet crash that killed him yesterday.
Allegedly.
And described, allegedly, and just we'll get to that in a second. And Putin described those on board as people who greatly contributed to fighting in Ukraine. We remember it, we know it, and we will not forget. And he called Prigozhin a talented businessman who was successful both in Russia and abroad. I mean, all of those things are, I guess, true. That said, I mean, there are a few different theories here. One theory is the official one, which is that I think they're saying there was like some sort of explosion on board that caused this private jet to crash. Of course, the one that everybody thinks is the case, at least in the mainstream, is that obviously this man was killed by Putin for trying to coup him, right, last month. And then the third option is one that I think you were alluding to, which is, maybe he didn't die. I would tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, I'll speak to all of them. I mean, I just do want to say that because, look, this is kind of crazier than fiction. Everything involving Prigozhin, he's known to have a lot of body doubles, different things like that. Was he trying to fake someone out? I don't know. But I only say that because even though they've taken bodies from the wreckage, and even though his name was on the manifest, there's still not an affirmative, like, we've seen the body. So Putin is making his statements. The Wagner headquarters had their windows lit up like a cross. So it certainly seems like he died, but it just seems a little weird to me that there's not like a more affirmative statement from the authorities themselves. Maybe the body's too mangled and they need to do some sort of dental work or whatever, but I just want to, just put that out there because I just feel like you never know what's going on with this guy. But I think it's fair. I think it's more than fair to assume he's dead, but just keep that in the back of your mind as this develops. But again, I think it's more than fair. Yeah, I mean, look, as for the Putin issue, I've certainly, given the fact that it seemed like the guy just tried to lead a coup in the country, it would sort of make sense. But I think there's also sort of a logical fallacy element to that as well, that I'm not saying it's not true, but it does sort of seem like, why would you just randomly wait 2 months and then do this plane crash as opposed to just arrest him at the time for the crimes that you said he committed and put him in jail or execute him or do whatever through some form of legality? And there are many answers to that. I mean, one answer might be is that Prigozhin's criticisms of the way the war effort was moving forward, even by many who did not support the Wagner actions, people were agreeing that some of those criticisms he was making, had resonance with the Russian people. So perhaps sort of an official form of punishment could have weakened the position, of the leadership there. In that sense, if people felt like he was being punished unfairly. So, I mean, there's reasons why you would do it this way, but it just seems like a little strange when, you just let a coup. So you got the guy dead to rights, basically. And according to the Russian government, they were investigating him for all this corruption or whatever. Then they seem to basically just let him go to multiple different countries, maybe even go to Africa based on that trip a few days ago. And then all of a sudden he just dies. Who knows? Always, of course, you can certainly say that there may have been some sort of malfunction on the plane itself, but you are certainly way more likely to die of being struck by lightning than in a plane crash. It's an Embraer plane, very Brazilian company, but very well-regarded company. So there's that. I think, to me, the most likely culprit feels like it's Ukraine, because it seems that Ukraine has heavily increase their use of special operations and intelligence-based operations to generate the, perception that they are doing well. I mean, they did this invasion of Crimea yesterday where they were sort of briefly on the coast and raised the flag. I mean, the Nord Stream 2 thing, which pretty much likely seems to be them, the bombing of the bridge in Crimea as well, the attacks in the Belgorod region. And, the story was widely dismissed because only Russia was reporting it. But there was a report from Russian media that Ukraine was getting ready to send people to Africa to try to disrupt Russian operations in Africa. And the fact that this happens just a couple days after Prigozhin is allegedly at least, in Africa sending a video. I mean, it just makes you wonder if there's some connection, there in the context of everything happening with Niger and Mali and Burkina Faso, Central African Republic, if perhaps there was some attempt to disrupt the Russian operations or Russian affiliated operations, Russian adjacent in Africa by taking out not just Prigozhin, but some of the other leaders of the Wagner group. Who knows? But just in general, even if it wasn't related to Africa, the huge increase in Ukraine, to me, it seems like a significant increase into the use of special operations and intelligence-based operations in order to, create momentum, that this fits very much in that vein. Certainly, they're not claiming that, but all over, of course, Ukrainian media, social media and whatever, people are really reveling in this. So I think that's a possibility that also has to be considered. But it also feels like, to me, one of those situations we may never really know the truth about what actually took place. And, we may be wondering for the rest of our lives or for a very long time, 50 years from now, it'll all come out. But either way, I think that it will have some impact, on how the war is conducted and how all sides are seen.
Yeah, and I will say this, regardless of what actually went down, if there's anybody out there who was considering being the next guy to try to do a coup against Putin, is probably rethinking it now. There's that. There's also, it's kind of interesting to, if you're sort of a typical Western, Russia-hating liberal, it's very confusing where you're supposed to stand on this, because you're supposed to hate Wagner. Therefore, you're supposed to hate Prigozhin, but you also hate Putin. So who, you know what I mean? Who do you say is bad? And so I just kind of, moments like these are a little bit funny to me. Maybe this is, just me being amused by what you called crazier than fiction, when it makes certain people's minds just sort of cannot compute,
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely, if you're a hater of Russia and Putin, this is confusing, because Wagner was worse than Putin, and it was that's the real raw edge of evil Russia, was the Wagner group. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of very legitimate culprits, from Ukraine to Putin to, potential just failure of the plane. So we'll have to just see. But yeah, definitely big news. I mean, it's happening at an interesting time, of course, in the context of, what's going on in Ukraine. Of course, the supporters of Ukraine are making a huge point recently of how there's been a tactically significant advance on the southern front of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. I'll let people go look at that for themselves. You can see Institute for the Study of War, which is kind of the most pro-Ukraine people putting out maps, really making a big deal out of it. But what you'll see, and the point that we made when we talked about this, is the map basically looks exactly the same as it's looked for the past 6 months. And of course, it's been interesting to note, to me, Rania, how the tone has changed in Western media quite a bit. And now there's a lot of open criticism of the counteroffensive. You've got these Western governments, of course, all these people speaking anonymously, saying, oh, we don't know what Ukraine's doing. Seems like they didn't listen to us, all these other things, which I find that to be ridiculous. I think that's just latter day. Now that it's not working, they don't want to be affiliated with it. But beforehand, it was all fine. And I'm willing to bet most of those war plans were drawn up in America and in the UK, and that they're just not working. But nonetheless, I think it's an interesting statement about where we are. I think it's a statement about what we were talking about in the previous discussion, with now growing criticism in the United States of funding for Ukraine. We don't know exactly what's going to happen in Germany, but I would say that the sort of disintegration of the left party, or potential disintegration of the left party, the possibility of a new party emerging around Sahara Wagenknecht, who is the main peace voice there in Germany. Who knows? I mean, who knows what these random farmers in the Netherlands are going to do? But nonetheless, you can see across Europe and the United States, there's, I think, some feeling of fatigue around this. And then obviously in the global South, for some time, there has been a huge desire for there to be some form of peace, for the conflict to be brought to an end, for there to be serious negotiations. And I think that it's not a coincidence that all of the mainstream media is all of a sudden publishing things that are way more critical of Ukraine than they've ever done really before, showing how the losses are huge and all these other things. I think they're trying to soften up the population in America, who they built up into this war frenzy that, Russia has to be pushed out of Ukraine, because obviously no real negotiations will take place without Ukraine's going to lose some territory. I mean, that's just the end of that. William J. Burns, allegedly the CIA director, when he went to Russia, offered Russia Ukrainian territory. So nothing for Ukraine without Ukraine, but then they're negotiating behind their back. So I think they're trying to soften up people here in the West to basically accept what will ultimately be terms of agreement that will probably be less favorable to Ukraine than what, all of the world leaders in the capitals of America and Europe were saying they would accept. So it seems like a very interesting moment in terms of the war. And I think that might be where this Prigozhin thing really comes down, as it could end up, I think, in retrospect, looking like a big inflection point before the start of a more serious attempt to bring the conflict to an end. I could be wrong about that, but I do think that, by next spring, the pushback in, America and Europe, I think, will be much more significant than it has been so far. And I think there's going to be some challenges, and they're looking to see if they can pivot out, before it's too late and before they lose too much.
Yeah, and you can never underestimate also how much a presidential election season may cause decisions to be made as well, in the sense that, if Ukraine is seen as doing horribly, or the stalemate continues, it just opens up, Biden to all these attacks of like, you're spending all this money on Ukraine, So we'll have to wait and see on that.
Well, let's go to our next story, which is, certainly a more positive story, and that is the very first Cuban participation in the Little League World Series. A team from Bayamo was able to participate, I thought, gave a very valiant effort. There is a great documentary about this team, Little League Dreams. You can find it on Belly of the Beast. And we have the director of Little League Dreams, Daniel Montero, with us right now. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us. Oh, can you hear us?
Can he not hear us? Hello.
Seems like he might be having some tech issues.
Yes.
Maybe you can see us, but
one
not
of
hear
those
us.
days. One of those days.
Yeah, internet is tricky. Well, I'll just shout it out again, the name of the film, in case somehow we don't get to it. Little League Dreams. Definitely, please. Belly of the Beast, which is a great media outlet covering Cuba and the impact of many negative U.S. policies, but it's a great, great documentary. Little League Dreams, about the team from Bayamo. If you follow the Little League World Series, you've already seen some of this. It was very positively mentioned on the broadcast, which I appreciated, because oftentimes these ESPN broadcasters are terrible when Cuban baseball issues are involved. But I thought they were, very gracious, regarding that. But I don't want to say too much about it, because we may get Daniel back, but also I want people to go watch the film. But a great moment, I think, to have Cuba participate for the first time, and a long running effort to sort of reunite the baseball cultures of America and Cuba, which have been, very ridiculously severed based on the blockade against Cuba.
Yes, indeed. The blockade against Cuba.
I thought you were going to offer some analysis of the Little League World Series.
Okay, this is not funny, Eugene. I don't watch baseball.
I don't know that. Maybe for all I know, you are like a
really,
real Little League World Series fan. I don't know.
Given what you know about me, did it really cross your mind that, oh yeah, Rania knows the teams and also understands the game? Yeah. That really crossed your mind? I know it's like 3 strikes and you're out. But I just know it's also a very long game.
It's actually still going on right now, the Little League World Series. Anyway, we'll move on. Hopefully we'll come back. We're going to move to another very, very important issue in terms of the just broader geopolitical state of things, and that are the elections in Zimbabwe, where current President Ernest Mnangagwa is going to the polls with his party, ZANU-PF, to try to stay in power. And we are very honored to be joined here once again by Rutendo Matinyari, who's the chairperson of the Zimbabwe Anti-Sanctions Movement and the founder of Zimbabweans Unite Against U.S. War and Sanctions. Rutendo, thanks so much for being back with us.
Good evening, and thank you guys for having me once again.
Well, it really is our honor, and we're in I guess, sort of day 2 of voting there in Zimbabwe. Voting was extended to make sure that everybody had a chance. So we're going to have to wait and see to some degree what the outcome of the election is. But I guess my first question for you, Rutindo, is more or less what's at stake in this election, I think, is maybe the important factor. I think all people here in America is that it's a battle between authoritarianism and democracy there in Zimbabwe. But from your perspective, what are the real stakes of this election?
I think the very first thing is that what's at stake is human rights. And I think the issue that we need to look at is the aspect that right now we're having elections under conditions of economic sanctions. And as you saw from a study that was written by Professor Brandon Boycio-Park, he said that he did a study that proved that sanctions hinder incumbent governments and give an advantage to opposition governments. And so basically, this is election rigging by sanctions. And so even though ZANU-PF is doing well, even though ZANU-PF is winning, I think it creates a bad precedent for countries to allow political parties that have called for the persecution of civilians through sanctions to be allowed to perform in elections, because then it's encouraging other people to either use violence or persecution by sanctions, denying civilians healthcare, water, education, and basic services on the pretext that those people will be forced to vote for the opposition. And this is exactly what is happening here.
And can you explain,
And
like,
as
what
for- and
does...
as-
Oh, sorry. No, sorry, continue.
Sorry. All right. So I wanted to say, as for the aspect that we've got an authoritarian government, according to the perceptions of the Americans, the fact is the Zimbabwean government is probably one of the most tolerant governments in the world, because you see a opposition that has gone to partner with foreign powers, and partnering with those foreign powers, it's asked those foreign powers to exert economic warfare on the people of Zimbabwe. Now, under normal circumstances, that political party in America would have been charged with a number of laws, the Smith Act, the Foreign Agents Reporting Act, probably even the Anti-Communist Act and the Logan Act. And they would be barred from participating in elections and charged with treason. But in Zimbabwe, that very same opposition that has committed treason against the Zimbabwean people runs all our urban municipalities. And that has to be something out of the ordinary, because even the British government just created a law that is called the National Security Act to actually arrest Britons that partner with foreigners, partner with enemies of Britain to go against the British. So Zimbabwe is very tolerant compared to the United States, the British, and other countries that don't tolerate treason. We have tolerated treason in the name of democracy. We have tolerated treason in the name of trying to avoid future sanctions.
Well, I'm curious, like, what? So obviously, you're talking about an opposition that's backed by the West. So what are they campaigning on? And I'm curious if Russia and China have played a role at all, not as countries, but I mean mentioning Russia and China, if they've been mentioned throughout this campaign cycle.
Well, first of all, the opposition does not have any campaign strategy. They do not actually have any real policies, except the fact that we've got sanctions, and the day that we win elections, we're going to ask Joe Biden to remove the sanctions. We're going to say to Joe Biden that the deal has been done, and he will remove sanctions, and investors will begin back into Zimbabwe. That is precisely what they're promising the electorate. The Russians and the Chinese become relevant in one aspect, that we should have been under UN sanctions, were it not for the veto of the United Nations, of the Russians and the Chinese that refused for sanctions to be imposed on Zimbabwe, because the Europeans had already agreed that they're going to use the UN to impose UN sanctions so as to make the sanctions legal. But the Russians and the Chinese did not accept. And we were with the government of Zimbabwe at the BRICS media conference last week, and they are part and parcel of the current BRICS Summit that's happening. And that is something that Zimbabweans keep being told by the government of Zimbabwe, that the relationship between Zimbabwe, Russia, and China is the reason why, for instance, we've now got an added capacity in electricity because we just built a new electricity plant or upgraded the current plant to be bigger and to give us more electricity. And we've now got the biggest steel and iron smelter in Africa that was also built by the Chinese. And we are going to probably be looking at creating nuclear power in Zimbabwe because of the Russians. We also have, obviously, some military hardware that we get, and infrastructure, roads are being developed, fertilizers are coming in. So Zimbabwe is actually busting the sanctions through the assistance of the Russians and the Chinese. And the government of Zimbabwe does quite a good job of communicating that to the Zimbabwean people.
Yeah, no, I think very well taken points on a number of points. We're having a few technical issues, I think, in terms of your sound, Rutindo. So we want to just take a second and see if we can get that figured out here, and then see if we can bring you back on in that regard. So let's just wait 1 second and see if we can get that figured out. I think these are all very, very relevant questions vis-a-vis the issue of Zimbabwe and what's going on there in the elections, which I think will have a lot of, potential repercussions in terms of the African continent, in terms of, ultimately, I think people's feelings that they can resist these massive sanctions regimes. I mean, I think that is something that Zimbabwe has been dealing with for so long, since 2001. To address these issues. So I think we have Rutindo back here on the line. Let's see if we can get him back. Yes, we do. So just to go back to you to continue the conversation, Rutindo, and I think that's a very good point in terms of how, Zimbabwe is seen in the West and the distortions of it as well. And I was having this conversation with someone the other day, and the fact that you can still, read in every newspaper that you can find in the UK and the US, that the land reform was totally unsuccessful, that, everything has been made a mess of. And I just said to someone, I said, they've had a bumper crop in maize, a bumper crop in tobacco, like year after year after year. So at what point is someone going to start to say that, this narrative is wrong? But it feels like that is another important distortion to dispel.
Absolutely. And the issue is, like I always say to people, the reason why you see this antagonism, the lies, the manufacturing of consent, is that if Zimbabwe is accepted as a success, then that means that decolonization can be successful. That's point number one. Point number two, Zimbabwe is actually reversing what is called the doctrine of discovery. Now, the doctrine of discovery basically is the premise upon which the United States is founded. Canada is founded on the same principle. Australia, New Zealand, Chile, and a number of other states that are established on colonialism and established on Europeans or Anglo-Saxons leaving Europe to go and conquer the New World, to take over the New World, and then establishing property rights as if the people that lived on those lands did not matter. So this is why the United States needs Zimbabwe to fail. Because if Zimbabwe doesn't fail, Zimbabwe then says it's okay for natives to take back what was theirs on the pretext that property rights do not start with colonialism, but they actually start before colonialism. Hence, natives are entitled to get what belongs to them. It also gives life to the 2012 Native Convention. And the Americans, the Britons, the Europeans, and Australians cannot afford for these principles like the Native Convention and the decolonization that breaks the discovery law to succeed. So they need Zimbabwe to look as a failure. They need Zimbabweans to look like they cannot farm. But what they also say to the rest of the world is non-white peoples can't farm without white farmers. And this is something that has to be debunked for equality, fairness, justice, and a non-racial society. Zimbabwe has been beating the sanctions. It has been producing maize. We, in fact, going to be exporting maize to one of America's most favorite nations, Rwanda. We're also going to be exporting maize to Congo because we've got a surplus because of our farmers. And the only reason that is happening is that we have been able to source internal finance from our own people. We've been able to create billionaires in Zimbabwe under these sanctions. We've adapted to the sanctions, and we've created partnerships outside the Western Bloc with the East, and it's working. We're getting fertilizers, we're getting machinery, we're getting tools, we're creating irrigation to mitigate climate change, and all this is making the Americans and their European counterparts very uncomfortable. That's why you see even in this election now, we've been seeing European observers who are supposed to be neutral giving money to reporters for them to report a certain narrative. And they've also been found with opposition leaders in secret meetings or passing little notes to them at rallies. And the question everybody is asking is that how can they be partial if they're going to be doing things like this? But we know they can't be partial because Europe exists through exploitation. Once exploitation is closed or that door is closed because Zimbabwe has succeeded and has taught other African countries to do this, then Europe's days are numbered. They're already beaten right now. The British are now having a smaller economy than in India, which used to be their colony, where they looted an approximate $34 trillion, and now they've been overtaken. So the question is, how else can they survive without destroying their former colonies or trying to re-exploit their former colonies? And what's happening in Zimbabwe. And this attempt to utilize the economic coercive measures to make sure that Zimbabwe's decolonization is a failure in order to keep propping up this Western system that is now dying.
Yeah, I mean, I think that those are all such good points, and it kind of leads me to what I wanted to ask you about, which is, how do you place what's happening with Zimbabwe into the context of what's happening across Africa right now? I mean, I guess I'm specifically talking about West Africa, which is in a different area of the continent. However, what we see happening with Niger specifically, Burkina Faso, Mali, and you do see sanctions have been imposed on these places for attempting to forge a path that isn't being dictated to them by the French or the Europeans or the Americans. And I'm just curious if you think this is something that might become a trend, like across the continent, or perhaps that's wishful thinking. But, Zimbabwe has long been a part of that trend and continues to be. So, yeah, how do you place this in the content of like the sort of larger continental dynamics?
What is scary is that the AU had an ambassador to the United States who was called Arikana Chihombori. Arikana Chihombori happens to be a Zimbabwean. And when she was AU, began to spread the message of what France was doing to its former French colonies in Africa. She began to debunk and demystify the continuation of colonialism pact. Now, this is something Arikana Chihombori was doing from a position of authority. The background, we were also doing exactly the same thing, communicating what it is that France was doing through France Afrique. So you can also locate currently in the former French colonies, in Niger, in countries like Burkina Faso. You can connect it back to what it is that is Zimbabwe, because Arikana Chihombori, being this ambassador who is a Zimbabwean, preaching the Zimbabwean philosophy of decolonization, definitely influenced the French country to start breaking French hegemony. And not only that, but the fact that Zimbabwe took its land, decolonized, put the resources of its people into the hands of Zimbabweans, and Zimbabwean black miners or artisanal miners being the biggest producers of gold, it has sent a message to every country. So now this is now a revolution that is taking place. We saw the same contagion affecting Julius Malema. He was influenced greatly by Robert Mugabe. We saw that Magufuli was also preaching the same gospel in Tanzania of compensating and emancipating the people of Tanzania by them controlling their resources, controlling their land, charging higher taxes and royalties to miners. These are all principles and philosophies that come from the Zimbabwean revolution. And this is what the Western world did not want. They did not want a radicalization of other Africans. And it didn't start now. It starts all the way back in our liberation struggle when Henry Kissinger wrote NSSM 39, in which he said no European forces or governments should ever be defeated on African soil. And this he was saying during the Rhodesian struggle or our independence struggle. He didn't want the defeat of the Rhodesians because he said it will radicalize other Africans to fight against white powers and white colonizers. And that would make Africa uninhabitable. And it's happening. It might be happening maybe 40, 50 later, but the trend is happening. And Zimbabwe is at the center of it's part and parcel of the psyche, parcel of the influence, part and parcel of ideology. And that ideology is only going to grow. And also have to give credit to say there were people like Thomas Sankara that already started in Burkina Faso, although people like Blaise Compaoré then reversed the gains of that particular struggle. But I think it continues to be a motivator and a muse for what is happening on the African continent.
No, I think that's such a great point, and I want to ask you just to follow up on that note, because one of the biggest issues that is being, discussed, certainly in Burkina Faso, but also, to some degree in Niger, at least by those who are out in the streets supporting the military transition, is what to do about the gold industry there in those countries. And, I think you look at Burkina Faso, seems like maybe already learned a little something from Zimbabwe, raising this issue of establishing a government-run gold refiner. But I wonder what you think other African nations that have these huge artisanal gold industries that are looking to move up the value chain and also to get more of their resources have to learn from Zimbabwe's experience on this front, which, we've talked about before in the show.
So what they did with Zimbabwe is the moment they imposed sanctions, our gold production went down. It went down below 10 tons. So that meant that Zimbabwe was removed from the London Bullion Market Association. And that way, Zimbabwe had to learn to look for new markets for its gold. Not only was it removed from the London Bullion Market Association because we're not producing enough, but the sanctions themselves would have meant that payments to Zimbabwe for its gold were always going to be blocked or be permitted by the United States. And we saw that with our diamonds, where we've got over $50 million that has been blocked for diamond payments, blocked by OFAC, and is currently money that was seized by the government of America. Now, with Zimbabwe realizing that with these diamonds, they then decided to look for alternative for their gold. Hence, we went through to the United Arab Emirates, India, and China. And that way, we were able to get payments for our gold. And I think this is the lesson we're teaching the rest of Africa. But not only that, Zimbabwe has created a gold digital currency. They've created a gold coin. And basically one of the first countries that is trying to fulfill what Muammar Gaddafi was killed for, which is the creation of a gold currency. Because we've got so much gold, why not turn it into a currency? Why not back up our currency with gold so that our currencies can have more weight, our currencies can have more value? But the Zimbabwean government is not just thinking of putting gold behind the currency, but other basket of minerals and very important strategic mineral resources that we have. So I think that's the lesson we can teach other African countries. Create your own refineries, mine your own gold, have less foreign companies mining your gold, have small scale and artisanal miners being locals, and let them from the benefit of mining their own resources. In Zimbabwe right now, our greatest millionaires and money makers at this time are being made in the gold industry. Educated people who actually just have the passion and the strength to go and dig are able to start digging $79. The Zimbabwean government gives them a $79 license. They then have to pay other fees, but at the end of the day, it's affordable and they can go and mine. And a lot of these guys have risen from nothing, from poverty, to become multimillionaires in US dollar terms. And this is exactly the same cycle that you saw in the United States of America and the creation of the titans of America, the creation of the tycoons of America, like Carnegie and Warburg and others. They were created by the gold rush, even though they might not have been participating. It's happening in Zimbabwe. The Americans are not happy. And hence, they started now trying to create these money laundering policies. They're trying to use them to close down Zimbabweans by saying that they're money laundering through gold. And now we're fighting back by trying to make African countries, BRICS, and the Africa Continental Free Trade Area to change regulations, to change and to make sure that banks are not answerable to the Financial Action Task Force regulations, but they're answerable to African laws, African rules, and African legislation, so that we can stop this use of the Financial Action Task Force to control the movement on the African continent, which is what they're trying to do. So we are also saying to other African countries, don't just mine the gold. You have to make sure that the banking laws, the banking rules that we are using in Africa are good for Africa so that money can move, investment can move, people can move, technology can move, and trade can happen on the African continent without being controlled by American pseudo-regulations and American G7 rules that are being spread as international law.
One final question I just want to ask you here. Any expectations about if there will be regional maybe repercussions of the election in Zimbabwe? Obviously, South Africa, the sort of scapegoating of Zimbabweans and other African migrants there is a bigger and bigger issue, unfortunately, in South Africa. A lot of people looking at this election vis-a-vis what will happen in Zimbabwe. Are you expecting any particular ripple effects from the outcome here on Zimbabwe and South African relations or other regional pieces?
The good thing about South Africa, the ANC fully understands the neocolonialism that is taking place. They understand the agenda of removing revolutionary movements. So they've shifted position. They've shifted position supporting Zimbabwe. We've heard the Secretary General of the ANC making it very clear that the opposition of Zimbabwe is a puppet government. It's a puppet of the West, and they do not want a client state of the United States next to them. And that is a very clear state. They do not want the opposition to come in. Elections in Zimbabwe have been pretty free and fair, besides a few procedural issues here. The opposition is losing legitimately. And if indeed the opposition loses, I don't think that any of the SADC countries are going to say that it was an unfair or it was a rigged. And moreover, we are trying to get the SADC region to get conscious of the fact that the rigging already had 22 years ago when the government of Zimbabwe was put under sanctions in order for the opposition to get an advantage. And so if there is anything that they might think is rigging now, would only refer to it as counter-rigging, and it should be acceptable if the sanctions have been acceptable as a means and a way to assist the opposition. Then ZANU-PF should be able to do what it wants. Hence, we also then trying to put pressure on SADC to say, if you keep quiet about sanctions and how they rig elections, then you have no place to stand to talk about any other form of rigging, because you have permitted the rigging of persecution of civilians by sanctions, deprivation of water, healthcare, education, in order to force people to vote for the opposition. And so we don't expect any fallout. The only problem we have is Zambia. Zambia currently has an observer who is the head of the observer mission for SADC. He has been interfering in the process. He has been canoodling with the opposition. His president is known to have given money to the opposition. So he is not impartial. He is very partial. He has a conflict of interest. His president has a conflict of interest. His president is the same person that has also accepted the Americans to put AFRICOM in Zambia so that they can complete what they call their Silk Road strategy that seeks to make sure that every single capital on the African continent is less than 3 hours away from an American air base or an American base or lily pad of some sort. We believe that Zambia is compromised. Zambia is a liability. South Africans aligning with BRICS, South Africans realizing that the Americans also want to remove them, and they've also begun to rig the next year's election by denying them loans and denying them support, are also realizing that the West are not their friends. So they're beginning to align with other revolutionary movements, and they're also beginning to mal the prospect of transforming the economy and probably even taking land. So we don't see any problems coming from there, maybe from Zambia, but at the end of the day, I think it's united. The region has enough revolutionary forces and movements to actually do away with any complaints or any form of sabotage by the West in this election.
Rutendo Matinyari, as always, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much for giving me an opportunity, and an apology. That was my kettle that was boiling.
No worries at all. We appreciate you as always, my brother.
Well, that was some really good analysis.
Yes.
And I love the way he framed it in the beginning too, because I got to say, reading articles in like the mainstream media, I'm just going to call it the New York Times since it's the best one to call out.
Sure.
It was like, I think the article was something like, what's like happening in Zimbabwe's elections? Here's what you need to know. And then it was like going on about, they were like, the elections got off to a chaotic start because there was long lines outside of polling places. I'm like, have you seen an American election?
Yeah.
Like, anyways.
Yeah. Anyways, well, before we close, Rania, and we're at the end of our guest, of course, but I just briefly want to say, since we've been doing a lot of coverage of Niger, it's by way of an update, as it were, in terms of today, what we've seen. I mean, we've seen sort of, two sort of things. Earlier in the day, it seemed like there was a lot more bellicosity coming from ECOWAS vis-a-vis the issue of in sort of invading essentially into Niger. The issue of what the transitional process is going to be is what the big thing is turning on now. Of course, after the ECOWAS observer mission was there over the weekend, the Nigerian rulers, government had said they were going to have a 3-year transitional process, and they were going to announce the rules of the transitional process after a 30-day dialogue with elements of civil society. So actually somewhat similar to what Burkina Faso and Mali have been doing. ECOWAS earlier today was saying that they didn't want to have any long, drawn-out engagements with them, that they were ready to go, that they were 100% prepared, they're moving troops around, and all these other sort of pieces. And, you see that the commissioner for peace and security of ECOWAS was the guy who was saying that essentially. And he was, more or less saying that they're determined to stop it. In the past few hours, though, interestingly enough, the president of Nigeria, Tinubu, the new president there of Nigeria, who seemed to be one of the most bellicose figures, is now seemingly backtracking a little bit and actually saying that he's holding back ECOWAS and other countries from an invasion. And that he is the one who's pushing more conversation and more discussion, and that there need to be quick talks and they need to find a way to do this. But it's an interesting change in tune that comes after there's been I think a significant amount of public opinion inside of Nigeria that is saying they do not want to see a war between the two countries. Even people who are critical of what's happening in Niger, are critical of the military, are saying that there needs to be diplomacy, there shouldn't be an invasion. We've seen the Christian Association of Nigeria, important Yoruba organizations, important Muslim scholars, all sorts of, just influencers and others in the social media space in Nigeria who have a lot of following make this point. The Senate of Nigeria, of course, has rejected, at least so far, the idea of intervention. So interesting to see the president of Nigeria, which is probably going to be the key cog in what takes place in Niger, start to backtrack a little bit. How much they'll backtrack, we'll just have to see. But, after it's been revealed by Algeria that France tried to overfly Algeria as part of some military operation, that's sort of negatively colored the ECOWAS piece a little bit more, I think, because it's made them more sort of cheek by jowl with the Western imperialists, which many people in Africa don't want. So still kind of status quo ante in Niger is that you've got huge protests happening in support, not protests, rallies, huge rallies happening almost every day in defense of the military transition, the possibility of a 3-year transitional period, a 30-day dialogue that's allegedly ongoing now with civil society about what those rules will be. Solidarity from Mali and Burkina Faso, who have sent planes to help defend Niger and have also been using their military force to bring aid across the border because of the sanctions, which are making it very difficult for people in Niger, and which the World Food Program says could actually lead to serious famine and hunger. So we're seeing, that happen, continue to happen. ECOWAS, some elements continue to be bellicose, but we're still continuing to see that they seem to not really be able to reach escape velocity on the idea of an invasion, although they claim they've picked a D-Day. So I think it's still a very tense situation, very unclear what could happen here. But I think the comments from the Nigerian president, Bola Tinubu, are very significant because he was one of the most aggressive out of the gate immediately and seems to now be kind of really pushing at least what seems like perhaps a little bit of a backtrack, a little bit of a different line in terms of how ECOWAS is going to approach this, could end up being quite significant. So just wanted to put some of that in there, Rania, before we close, so just people who are wondering know, more or less where things are standing on that issue.
Well, I will say this on a more positive note, because a lot of that sounds quite alarming.
Okay.
Algeria did say that they would not allow France to use their airspace in any potential French military intervention. Of course, it's in Niger. So karma, I guess.
Yeah. It was a very strategic leak, too, by the Algerian government, which I think was definitely designed to put the brakes on what's happening in ECOWAS to some degree. But ECOWAS has said they won't be stopped by Algeria. So, you have these inter-African tensions also growing. So a very dangerous situation. But I think what we've seen from civil society in many of these countries is that they, ultimately are not willing to do this. I think people in the region can certainly see the implications of this could be very, very significant. And they've already been significant, honestly. I mean, you look at Nigeria, the parts that border Niger, I mean, the economy is basically in free fall because it's a cross-border economy. So, there's a lot of people who are being hurt by this. But anyway, we can come back to that and do more of that at a different time, at a different date. That's going to do it for us here on the freedom side. Rania, anything you want people to know before we get out of here?
Well, just make sure before the show ends to be sure to like this episode. It helps in the algorithm. Also, do make sure that you are subscribed to Breakthrough News on YouTube in case you stumbled across us during this live stream. Also, you can access exclusive content on Breakthrough News by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/Breakthrough News. Really do encourage you to do so. It helps support the show. And also then you get to get extra content and cool merch. So do it. Become a patron.
You do indeed. And we thank all our existing patrons. We thank all our guests. We thank everyone who is watching here tonight. And of course, you can find us on social media at BT Newsroom, in addition to here on YouTube at our channel that you're already on. Hit subscribe, hit the bell for the alerts. And for myself, for Rania, and for the rest of our Breakthrough News team, we will see you next week on the Freedom Side.